So hello there, welcome back to the recording of the specific fallacies. This time we'll focus on the violations of the usage rule, and this is the last recording because the usage rule is also the last rule of the 10 rules for critical discussion. So let's take a look at this rule. It says parties must not use any formulations that are insufficiently clear or confusingly ambiguous, and they may not deliberately give wrong interpretations of the formulations of the other party. Now this rule is a little bit tricky because it talks about insufficient clarity and confusing ambiguity, and those are of course rather subjective terms. Now to illustrate how this rule can nevertheless be violated, I have some clear-cut examples, but maybe the first example is a little bit challenging to understand, to see what's going on. But I wanted to put it in here because it's Aristotle's own example when he illustrates fallacies that depend on language use, and that's of course what we're talking about here. Now let's read the example first, and then I'll give a brief explanation. So he says, if what someone has, he later does not have, he has lost it, for someone who has lost one die alone will not have 10 dice. See? So this, I would argue, is a fallacy of misusing unclarity. But to maybe explain that, it's maybe better to take a look at this adapted version of Aristotle's example. It's adapted by Erik Krabbe, and he put it in a dialogical form, and we see that we have a discussion between A and B. And A starts and asks B the question, if someone no longer has what he once had, do we say that he has lost it? And B is very compliant and says yes, thus we may define what it means to lose something. Then A continues, suppose John has 10 dice and loses just one of them. In that case, wouldn't John no longer have 10 dice, whereas he once had them? And B again says exactly. A, so according to our definition, John would have lost 10 dice. Certainly. And so B is nicely tagging along, but then we have A, but we suppose he just lost one of them. Good grief, says B, so he's really shocked. And the thing here is that he is right to be really shocked, because here what's going on actually in the argument by A is that the concept of 10 dice is used as though it's one individual. And so if it loses one, then it doesn't exist anymore, then we lose us all. But that's of course quite interesting, an interesting take on how this would normally work. And you could do it, but it is a little bit unclear. I mean, there's this possibility to do it with 10 dice, to use it as an individual concept, but it's not really something that happens quite often. And so therefore, probably B is a little bit surprised here. Now, the language rule or the language usage rule can be violated in another way as well, and this is an example of such a violation. So we have all living beings come from other living beings. Therefore, the first forms of all of life must have come from a living being, and that living being is God. Now, regardless of whether you believe in God, there's something suspicious about this reasoning, I would say. I would argue, actually, that there's a fallacy of misusing ambiguity. And the reason for that is twofold, actually. So we have the term come from here in the argument. So all living beings come from other living beings, which means that there's some kind of reproduction system, right? So biological reproduction. You come from your parents, they come from their parents, etc., etc. Now, when you take a look at the second use of coming from, all life form must come from a living being, there we're talking about originate. So we're not really talking about biological reproductivity. And these two senses, they are perfectly fine in using coming from, I mean, they perfectly fine meanings, but not if you do it in these different meanings in one and the same argument. That's just not very reasonable. There's another tricky thing here, and that is about living beings. Oops, so there's a circle, because here living beings refers to biological entities, but then in the end, it's being concluded that that proves that we're coming from a living being in a very different sense, namely metaphysical being. So you can question whether these two uses of living being, these two senses actually, whether that's really reasonable to use in this way. So a fallacy, I would argue. And so what we can actually be a little bit more clear about ambiguity here. Let's take a look at this picture to illustrate that. And my question here is, what do you see? Or maybe I should have asked, what do you see first? Because maybe you saw first the rabbit with the ears being here and its little nose being here. Or maybe you saw first the duck with its beak here and the eye is still, in this case, the eye of the duck. Now this is the duck rabbit, quite a famous picture because Wittgenstein already used this picture to talk about how we talk about language, so seeing that it is a duck or seeing something as a duck. And also he discussed what kind of cognitive changes go along with this and whether, the world is then still the same. It goes too far to go into this philosophical discussion, but maybe a nice note to know is that apparently around Easter time in the US, people see this picture much more quickly as a bunny than a duck. So nice to know, right? Anyway, this kind of ambiguity, because that's what we're dealing with, we see two different pictures in the same picture. That is also possible with words. And we've seen that before, but just to be clear, here you can see an example of ambiguity in the sentence, because we have man helps dog bite victim. So there's a victim who was bitten by a dog, and this man helps this victim. Or we have the second reading here, which I like very much, is man helps dog bite victim. So the man actually helps the dog bite the victim. So that's the second reading. Probably not the first one that you read, but it's still there though. And then we have the second example here as well. I saw her duck. And maybe you now think first of the animal because we saw it just now. But she could also just have ducked, right? The verb ducking, to duck, when something is thrown at her, for instance. So compare these two sentences because there's a difference between the cause of the ambiguity. You see, in the first sentence, the entire sentence is ambiguous, but there's no single word that the ambiguity results from. Well, that is the case in the second reading. And we can say the sentence structure, so the syntactic qualities of the sentence, they make sure that there's ambiguity here, that you have these two different senses. While in the second example, there's just this word that is ambiguous, and the ambiguity arises from this semantic entity. Now you can be more specific about our living beings example, because I already said, okay, it's about living beings and it's about coming from. There the ambiguity lies in. So what you can say now is that it's not about sentence structure, so it's not syntactically ambiguous, but you can specify this ambiguity as semantic ambiguity. So it's always nice to do that. So, okay, long story short, we have two types of violations of the usage rule, namely the fallacy of misusing unclarity and the fallacy of misusing ambiguity. Now, as I said before, it's tricky that this fallacy can occur in more or less subtle ways. And what's even trickier is that these fallacies actually can occur in combination with other fallacies. And is actually, I would argue, quite likely that this happens. So take a look at this example, and that will probably illustrate this point. So you have the first argument: you should make that dog of yours stop barking, or I'll make sure he never barks again. I try to read this in my most threatening voice. But you can see there's a threat going on, and you know this is unreasonable because it's, of course, intuitively unreasonable, but also because it's a violation of our very first rule of the critical discussion rules, namely the freedom rule. It's called the fallacy of the stick, in other words, the ad baculum fallacy. Now, in the second version, it's actually the same argument, but it's formulated in a little bit of a different way. So here it goes. It might be good if you would make your dog stop barking. It would be a pity if he never barks again. So we have subtle changes like that dog of yours and your dog. But what is more interesting here is in this second part, so it would be a pity if he never barks again, that the actor here, the person who makes sure this dog never barks again, is suppressed. So we don't know who's doing this. And so it's actually sort of quite vague, and it is mimicking kind of sound argumentation, like pragmatic argumentation: brush your teeth twice a day because else you'll get bad breath. So it's something that is like a natural phenomenon, and here it's presented as such. So it doesn't show that I, as an arguer, am actually responsible for the, stopping the dog barking, if you know what I mean. So here I would argue actually that we also deal with some kind of language use issues, and you could qualify it as misusing unclarity. What you should do then is argue based on these two different formulations what the alternative was if you use this kind of argument, why it's unclear, why it's less clear than this formulation. And at the same time, don't forget to mention the first fallacy, the ad baculum, because that's probably the reason why the discussant is unclear in this formulation. So that's all for now. It's all for this rule, but it's all for the critical discussion rules as well. So I hope this helped. I hope it's clear now. If not, you know where to find me. And so for now, let's just say, okay, thank you very much, and hope to see you soon. Thanks.